We will all post this, right?
Sure.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Women in AI Talks, where we feature inspirational leaders in this fire chat. Today, we have Anjana Susarla with us today, who is a professor of responsible AI. A little bit about Women in AI. Women in AI is a nonprofit that started in France and has members from over 100 countries. Our mission and goal is to increase diversity in the world of artificial intelligence. Whether you're a researcher, a startup, or product manager, or any of the data science roles, we invite one and all to join this community, and please check our free Slack channel. And without further ado, a little bit of introduction about Anjana. Anjana Susarla holds the Omura Saxena professorship in responsible AI at the Broad College of Business. She earned an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology, Chennai, a graduate degree in business administration from the Indian Institute of Management at Calcutta, and PhD in information systems from the University of Texas at Austin. Her work has appeared in several academic journals and peer-reviewed conferences, and she has been interviewed in an op-eds published in several media outlets. Anjana, welcome to our session today.
Thank you for having me.
A little bit about myself. I'm Swati Young, Chief Technology Officer of Technot Solutions, where I help organizations increase their performance by implementing artificial intelligence and machine learning applications, specifically in the areas of healthcare, finance, transportation, and so on and so forth. I've also been featured in international conferences as keynote speaker, and my blogs have appeared on Forbes Technology Council as well. And today I am thrilled to present to you Anjana, Professor of Responsible AI, and to learn more about her journey in this space, as well as some principles around responsible AI. So Anjana, tell me, I know that last couple of years, there's a lot of conversation around ethics of AI, how to build ethical AI systems, and also this whole concept of responsible AI. I've seen Microsoft publish their frameworks, IBM has their own framework. So how did you enter into this world of responsible AI? I know your background is in technology with prestigious universities, but why did you pick this and why now?
So I think my journey to responsible AI started with, I was doing a lot of research on social media. And at one point, I started partnering with hospitals and healthcare organizations to just study the use of social media for healthcare. So almost 1 out of 10 search queries on Google are health related. Sites like YouTube post millions of videos about all common healthcare conditions. And this is even pre-COVID. There was enough doctors and physicians were, on the one hand, this is a great new channel for information about healthcare to educate patients. But on the other hand, the question is also, what's the quality of information that's out there? Is there any, do we have any authoritative auditing of just the stuff that's put out on social media platforms relating to common chronic conditions? So we actually partnered with doctors to create a deep learning based tool that will evaluate how much medical information was there in videos on YouTube. We took one chronic condition, diabetes, because diabetes affects millions of Americans. It's one of the most common chronic conditions. And what we found, I guess it's no surprise, the most popular videos, most engaging videos are the ones that had very little healthcare information. So on the one hand, there's this enormous potential for misinformation, as it were, but there's also the danger that people are just turning to these instead of valid medical advice. There is no credentialing or verification of the sources, authoritative sources. And so I think that's the journey that took me to responsible AI. I soon realized that this problem is endemic in many other settings. In today's world, we are turning to these digital platforms for almost every aspect of our life without there being independent audit or verification. The kind of software engineering type principles that you'll take for granted if you actually build commercial software in a company. A lot of things that we're doing is just like there's this kind of umbrella of AI, and people think this is some new technology. So there's not many guardrails. And so that was my journey into, so what is it that we should do next? We've identified the problem, but we need solutions.
No,
And
exactly. You have touched a nerve there, because I was also participant in co-authoring ethical AI framework for the US government, and it opened my eyes to a lot of different aspects of it and the whole world of researchers in the ethical AI space for sure. So one of the things, I've heard an interesting story, right? So apparently, this was a news story, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago. So there was some software that was used in airports to scan people's images, right? Photos and things like that, to check
Mhm.
their authenticity and all that. And it so happened that one software mismatched a Chinese person's face, saying their eyes were too closed,
Mhm.
right? So, which is basically shows us that the data did not have enough ethnic diversity to identify the various types of features,
Yeah.
right? So, such a huge red flag it raised in the ethical AI community.
Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit about what are some foundational and fundamental principles that
Mhm.
have to be considered while designing an AI system that makes it responsible.
Yeah. So, there are various guidelines. I think you alluded to it. Um, um, Microsoft has developed some use principles. Um, IBM has come up with some set of principles. There's a Responsible AI Institute. I've sort of worked with them on bringing together some sort of pedagogical approaches. So, what are some aspects of responsible AI? Responsible AI requires much more than understanding just the algorithmic bias and correcting for bias. It also requires transparency, explainability, some kind of a human in the loop decision making systems. It also requires a um, data ethics or data justice and privacy, and also auditing and compliance is a very important part of responsible AI. So there's various recommendations that we need to have some sort of a, along with releasing any model, AI model, we need to come up with model cards. We need to come up with sort of best practices and some caveats about even what are some flaws or problems that could happen with. And your story about facial recognition reminded me of how, the researcher Joy Bulwamini, when she was a doctoral student at MIT, she realized that some face scanning thing was not really very good at recognizing her, and that's what led her to collaborate with Timnit Gabru, who used to be at Google. And they both authored this like really path-breaking work that audited a lot of commercial software for used for facial recognition. And they find that there's even this notion of intersectional fairness. It was doing really badly, especially for women who happen to be African American, darker skinned women. So I think these are the questions. How much can we test and how much can we validate? And how much do we have an independent third party assessment of the black box AI software that oftentimes we are using without sort of any checklist or without any fair use principles, as it were? And that's the question for us.
Yeah, you brought out an important point about Joy Bolamani, and I think they recently came out with the movie Coded Bias that's
Yeah.
also on Netflix, that shows how much bias is in facial recognition systems, especially against the darker skins and so
Mhm.
on and so forth. So, in your course or in your conversation, have you encountered various use cases, right? So, one
Yeah.
of the things that I've read about is in natural language processing, also based on sentences and word formation, there
Mhm.
is some bias. For example, it's interesting to know that based on words, some of NLP algorithms think that doctors are mostly men and
Yeah.
judges are mostly men, and cooks or professional chefs are women, and
Yeah.
so on. So all these biases there even in natural language processing. So
Yes.
talk to us a little bit about different use cases and how do you approach, because facial recognition
Mm.
algorithms are very different from predictive analytics, which is so different from natural
Yes.
language processing.
Yeah. So natural language processing, one thing the research has shown is even hate speech. How do we flag something as hate speech? Sometimes they can be really bad at catching like ethnic dialects or specific, let's say, minority community uses some different words and they can be falsely flagged. So that is one of the huge problems with natural language processing methods. Others, if you're looking for like these things like ARI, automated readability indices, and so on, that again may have its own biases in terms of, I would say, is it actually capturing the intricacies of how maybe different communities use language? So there is again a training data problem. The third problem I would also identify is that in some of my own work studying healthcare, um, how patients actually use social media to educate themselves about healthcare. We found that patient education guidelines actually suggest that there's something called understandability, which is how the patient education experts define understandability of medical information. Now, we developed machine learning based guidelines to quantify that for social media. And we find that, again, understandability is actually highest for like a very misleading kinds of healthcare information, which is not so much a bias of the algorithms, but it's a cognitive limitation. It's like a cognitive bias of people, right?
Can you give us an
Yeah,
example of that?
yeah, I will. So, during COVID times, a lot of states, the public health departments put out guidelines for what we should be like if you are, all of us are concerned about COVID. So let's see, we want to read up what the public health authorities in our state or our district have put some guidelines out there. The question though is, how well are these guidelines written? In what format? Is this comprehensible by every individual? Now, patient education standards actually say that most communication given to patients should be at like the fifth grade reading level or seventh grade or something like that. So there's some lexical measures. But if we took a machine learning or natural language processing approach and try to automate, let's look at 50 states in the US and all the detailed public health guidelines put out, are states actually passing the standards? Turns out that most of the health education directives put out by state departments, they are failing this fundamental test. They are at a higher reading level than what a patient education expert would recommend. So is this an example of algorithmic bias? Not so much algorithmic bias, but it's definitely something where we are not inclusive enough and not taking into account what people actually need from healthcare information. They don't need a bunch of very complicated words and terminology. They want something that's easily digestible and they can use in their daily life. And I think that's one interesting use case. But there's many others. I think you find again similar things of age related biases, gender related issues using an NLP when it comes to lending, for example. I think banks, we find that there's some systematic, like a digital redlining almost things going on. So those would be use cases. Oh, there's one more famous example. I think this is something where that was probably example is from Amazon.
Mhm.
Very famous example. They tried to develop this tool, automated tool for resume screening.
Right. I heard about
You
that.
heard the
Yeah.
story, right? And so what was ending up happening is that they were ignoring the past history, which is for that software type of develop architect kind of a role. Primarily men were hired. So if we
Mhm.
just do analysis of the language in the resumes,
Right.
women tend to use very different adjectives to describe themselves compared to men.
Mhm.
It's like this resume screening tool is downvoting
Mhm.
gendered adjectives that women are more likely to use and upvoting the male sounding verbs. And similarly, somebody who played, I don't know, some women's sports and went to a women's college will get downgraded. And someone's resume, the very successful factors turned out to be things like, did someone play lacrosse in college and their name is Jared and things like that. So
Mhm.
it's a very prominent like NLP fail
Mhm.
because you're failing to consider the context in which, and you're
Right.
just assigning some meaning to just random like coincidences.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And since then, I know like City of New York and other cities have started considering some policy around using AI in recruitment and so on. So
Yeah.
definitely, that is something to think about. I personally have been involved in conversations with some governmental agencies about using AI in recruitment, but more so about actually matching and bringing up more candidates, and diversity and inclusion is on the top of the list as to how to we consider more diverse candidates. So
Yeah.
that's a good example. And you brought about the transparency and interpretability, right? So one of the concerns, even
Mhm.
when I lead a machine learning strategy or data science teams, one of the concerns is that technology can only be do so much, and there is still ongoing research as to how do we increase the transparency of, say, neural networks. We can easily, when you're talking about regression algorithms, decision trees, yes, there's weightage of parameters that we can see
Mhm.
to increase the transparency of our algorithms. But when it comes to RNN, CNN, how can these so-called black boxes, how can we make it more transparent, or interpretability and explainability? Have you heard of ongoing research in that area? And what are some inputs over there?
So one of the things we do is we try to add some frameworks too. So you can use, there's some advantages in using AI, which is I would say the efficiency with which you can do prediction and pattern recognition. Can we keep those advantages and correct for some of those biases is how I like to think of it. So we can have frameworks based on explainability and we can add them to our neural network outputs. And I think that's so we can evaluate our different features. And I think they're an example of a startup that's doing good work in the space from what I've seen of is Fiddler. Fiddler does some of the explainability things. I think they've done a very good job. Um, Likewise, I think companies can be more mature in terms of also maybe devising like a challenge for explainability or making it interpretable, like a hackathon around those ideas. So all these, I think the standard approaches will be like use a tool like Lime or SHAP on top of your machine learning method to make it more explainable. But you can, there's more creativity possible there. And studying like more of the feature weights and training our data scientists to build explainable models should also be part of the toolkit, I would say.
No, that's a good point, that most common techniques I have come across online and SHAP as well. I think there is so much room for innovation in this space, and not just innovation, research also, frankly, because while on one hand, neural nets provide some extensive, comprehensive coverage of complex data, right? Image I worked on a data science project for lung cancer research where we had to go and use CT scans and find the exact visceral fat, and we had to use TensorFlow and so on and so forth.
Right.
There are specific use cases where we have to use neural nets, and that's like you said, that's the efficiency of using such a neural network. But there's so much research to be done in this space for sure.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
extent
go ahead.
that I would like to say, that there has to be some self-awareness or mindset of continual improvement in these things.
Right.
Obviously, it's hard to get everything right the first time, but
Mhm.
the extent that companies like have audit themselves on these practices and learn and keep improving, I think that's so having some frameworks to do some sort of validation and compliance and auditing is also very important to get all these things right.
Yeah, no, that is a total segue to my next question.
Okay.
So, on one hand, there are technology companies like the big five, Amazon, Google, Facebook, but other companies which are technology is not their product, right? There are retail companies and,
Right.
all other types of sectors, finance sector and retail and so on and so forth. How do all these organizations, when they are implementing all their machine learning algorithms, which they are, most financial institutions are doing it, whether they are banking or investments.
Yeah.
So how do these organizations have to consider the risk of not evaluating responsible AI?
Yeah, that's absolutely great question. And I think that, there is only two approaches in my mind. One is if you are very large, like a JP Morgan or, American Express kind of a company, you can build your own best practices, as it were. Like some of the conversations with folks in some of these large banks has been really wonderful, right? Because they understand the risks that we are, consumer facing organizations, that the FTC and others are looking at us carefully, and our own consumers expect us to be responsible. So they have that awareness and they will sit and ask these questions and develop best practice guidelines within their organizations, either with partnership with, like you mentioned, some of the work you are doing. So you can have partnerships with technologists, or maybe they can develop their own standards. But what if you're a small company and you don't have these deep pocket resources? What are you going to do? Well, one option is to go for maybe some auditor. Um, Companies are coming up with some best practices like responsible AI auditing by Responsible AI Institute or For Humanity. Some of these companies offer guidelines. The third approach that companies can take if you don't have deep pockets is use some frameworks that are already developed by, say, Microsoft. Just adapt it into your organization as best as you can. And I think that way, at least, you will avoid getting, the backlash from consumers and your stakeholders and your own employees about, are you using technology in a responsible manner?
No, that's a great point. I have seen the rise of responsible AI auditing companies also, and being used extensively by especially in startups and things like that. So if you're a startup and you have an AI tool that you're selling to your customers, you want to evaluate on your DNI and other responsible AI and fair practices as well. That's a good point. So my next question I wanted to understand a little bit, and this is just my curiosity, is that what does your curriculum look like, and who are some of your students? Is it like a master's program? Is it augmented program?
So I don't teach just one set of students. I do also research on responsible AI. So I would say that I incorporate responsible AI into some of the classes I already teach for master's programs. I also work with some for exec programs and design, like workshops and other. So part of my thing is also working with companies for experiential engagements. And I also do research on responsible AI practices. So I would say it's all across the board.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so what are some of the master's program? Is it people in data analytics stream can opt for this as well?
Yeah,
Okay, that
exactly.
makes sense. That makes sense. And it's really an important topic to learn, because it too often we take it for granted, and we do a postmortem as what has gone wrong there, rather than incorporating it during the design phase, during the discussion and discovery phase as well.
Mhm.
So that is good to know that people who are interested can avail that program as well.
Mhm.
Responsible AI as an actual curriculum in a university to study for sure.
Mhm.
And what would your advice be for somebody who wants to enter into this field of responsible AI? I know there is a new role called AI ethicist that has been created, and large organizations have it. But if somebody wants to pivot into, oh, I have a philosophical background, how can I pivot and offer my background into a responsible AI discussion, or even look at it as a career? Because there are much needed philosophers into this mix that we have to bring to the table.
Yeah, I think that AI ethics as a career is a kind of a very individualistic path, in my opinion, because there's people in computer science who study fair AI. And there's a conference on fair and accountable machine learning. It's called FACT conference. So that community has become more mature, developing sort of guidelines or developing metrics. And there's also, I think, the people, very interesting conversations I've had with colleagues in law school. So lawyers are also interested from very different perspective, because it's the question is, is there a disparate impact, disparate treatment? Is it violating some equal opportunity, equal employment protection clauses? So that's a different way of reasoning. So who is ideally an AI ethics person? It should be really someone who understands all that, which seems, it's almost impossible for one person to be at that. But there's very interesting Meryl Hildebrandt and her colleagues I've seen who work at the intersection of law and computer science. So that teams are that's, I think, a great example of people who can span these boundaries. What I would say to my younger students, master's students and executive MBAs or people in various master's programs is that I think you should just develop a flavor and appreciation of this, because to some extent, fair use or responsible use of AI should be part of every job description in today's world, as AI is there everywhere. So you can always get independent, like a assessment of maybe some responsible AI auditor type of a thing, or maybe as this industry matures, it would be like you have all these certificates for information security, CISO, and all those others. I think a day will come when responsible AI certification will be like that. It would be a portfolio, one of the things you will add to your skill set or curriculum.
No, that's a very interesting thought there, just like the CISO certifications.
Mhm.
Yeah, definitely. It's an intersection between, I look at it as humanities, philosophy, law, um,
Mhm.
and also understanding it from a computer science perspective also. So that's a good point. So maybe there's some certifications that would come up in the near future even about it.
Mhm.
And lastly, I have one last question before I'll turn to the audience for questions, is that what are some ongoing research topics that you're seeing in this area that's widespread throughout the world, if not in the US?
Mhm. Well, I think that what's very interesting really is even just understanding the limits of, I would say, algorithmic oversight or automated decision making everywhere. So there was this very disquieting example from Europe where almost a decade long investigation of in Netherlands, they were using some sort of automated method to cut down on what they considered welfare fraud.
Mhm.
But that turned out to be very, very damaging for specific minority communities. So likewise, in the US, we are seeing these if people are applying to rent houses,
Mhm.
the leasing, there's a lot of automated software there as well. And so is there some disproportionate standards being applied again in those software? Similarly, when it comes to bankruptcies, are there some targeted impacts that can reduce these burdens on some groups of people? So I think we still have ways to go before we uncover some of those systematic impacts.
Mhm.
I think one problem I see in the responsible AI, no, not with the people who do responsible AI, but the general public by and large, we hear these stories,
Mhm.
facial recognition. A
Mhm.
year later, everyone will think, oh, facial recognition, that was a problem 2 years ago, it's solved now. It's far from completely being solved. So
Right.
I think that awareness that this is constant improvement, that needs to be there.
Mhm.
And so I think that's what I would say about the current direction, like not just my own research, what are interesting directions will be just very sector specific.
Right. Right. Definitely.
Like we hear also what are some problems with responsible use of AI in these emerging models. So we hear so much about blockchain, or we hear about some metaverse, or
Mhm.
digital twins, or things like that. Are they suffering the same challenges?
Yes, they
Not in-
definitely are. Yeah,
Yes.
from conversations with my friends working, especially my friend Ingrid, she does a lot of work in blockchain, and she's doing that whole ethical perspective of what are those. Yes, you bring that is also a good point about emerging technologies.
Yeah. So I think that's another, we have a long way to go. That's what I would say.
No, yeah, this was really good. I think you summarized it very well, that there is this whole disconnect between, yes, we hear these news stories, and they some after a time period they sort of wane off, but is the systematic problem gone along with the story, or is it still research? Looks like it's still under research, and we're uncovering and unearthing more and more use cases, and so we have to increase that visibility of those use cases and what can be done. So
Mhm.
turning on to audience questions, I think I can request the audience to come off mute and ask their questions, but we have one in the chat I can start with. How would we begin to provide a certification for responsible use of AI? Which regulatory bodies would be able to take on the challenge? Should ethical AI be a compulsory training in education? Asks Theodora. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, great. I think that let me start with the first question. How do you provide these certifications for responsible use of AI? So, in Europe, to start with, there's new Digital Services Act, and there's also a lot more act on algorithmic. Like there was a Child Safety Related Act in England. European Union has also adopted some of these, like a right to explanation, and I would say whole host of things around algorithmic accountability. Some frameworks around where you cannot just use automated decision making, but you need to have a human in the loop. Uh, we can request a right to explanation, right? One of the things you hear even from Uber drivers in today's world is that Uber doesn't tell the driver how they are being compensated, right? And one thing that has happened is, yes, maybe fuel prices are high. Uber is charging higher rates. Is that being like equitably distributed, right? So there are, I think, in various states in the US, there are some initiatives and proposals around, do I have a right to an explanation? European context, the answer was that there was a right to explanation. I think there was a case with Ola, and maybe this was also in the Netherlands. The judge ruled that there is a right to explanation. So, to answer the question succinctly, Theodora's question, what regulatory bodies would be able to take on this challenge? In the United States, it would very much fall within the purview of the Federal Trade Commission, the EEOC, the Equal Employment and Opportunities Commission. There's also the other bodies, the federal, I think the bodies that would look at these would be, I would say the employment, the folks who make employment related laws and so on. In Europe, I think these were broader things that were taken by EU when whoever does the digital services rights, it's the same set of bodies that have adopted. But we are very far from a global standard. I think that has not happened. And is there a convergence in terms of, like in India, I have seen that the Reserve Bank of India has put out some guidelines that will apply to maybe digital lending, right? It's broadly, they've put out some guidelines. So these are various bodies that can do the same thing in the, everywhere in the world. The lending agencies, the consumer safety agencies, the trading commissions, the Federal Communications Commission in the US, all these will have various, I would say, different pieces of regulation that would all be affected by algorithmic decision making. And so they are the people with the right power. And talking about ethical AI, should it be in education? I strongly believe that we need what I would call as algorithmic literacy, because a lot of times we're using AI and we're using algorithms without thinking about how they're impacting our life. We just use apps, we use social media, and we don't think about how those recommendations are nudging us into different actions and so on.
Right, and collectively impacting society as a whole.
Society as a whole, exactly. So there was a very nice, initiative. I think MIT Media Lab developed this exercise for middle school students.
Mm-hmm.
It'll ask them to imagine how, if you were redesigning YouTube, how would you do it? It's a nice thinking exercise. So, I think that algorithmic literacy has to be there definitely from a younger age.
Mm-hmm. Right, and also with that ethical AI concept itself. So definitely, that's a good point. Yeah. Thank you, Anjuna. Any other questions? Please come off mute if you have any other questions for Anjuna. Okay, looks like not, or else you can feel free to email us as well. I can put my email in the chat, and Anjuna, if you can do the same, we can get some questions. Thank you so much, Anjuna, for your time today. This was a wonderful discussion. And for those of you who have participated today, please look forward to other Women in AI events. Thank you again for your time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.